Hello everyone, today we talk about 13th century cities, looking a bit at their functionment and certain aspects concerning politics and society in the low Middle Ages. So we are entering a bit more in detail, time and space, or at least in details, and today we focus on the 13th century city, which is in many ways the apex of medieval urbanism, as far especially as the broader infrastructural, demographic, also in terms of economical, of traffics, right? Is concerned. This is the top of medieval civilization. Then that there is the crisis at the end of the century, the Great Break in the 14th, and fundamentally, European cities will not come to be as large, as dynamic individually, right, as they had been before. At least, naturally, it depends on the standards, but yeah, I mean, altogether, even just look at, how populated they were, right? Or just the fact that they stopped, completing cathedrals because they ran out of resources, that would be done in the 19th century, right? And certain cities wouldn't re-expand beyond the medieval walls up to the 19th century again, right? So that gives you an idea of the magnitude of the contraction. That naturally is not just measurable through the city, but because there are also the relations of the city with the countryside and so on. But yeah, I mean, tendentially speaking, here we're talking about a moment that we don't even know excessively much. Like the city is definitely the some at least of the best. If not sometimes certain realities, definitely, especially in the city-states, the best documented reality we have, right? So we're talking specifically here of mostly Western Europe. This is where urbanism took a greater form. We will be talking both of, cities like Paris or London, were starting to be, especially London, real capitals as a the most important kingdoms of the time. We're talking about the Italian city-states and other thriving centers like, Barcelona, right? And looking a bit at the, especially at the internal function. That is, what was fundamentally a 13th century city about this time. So, first of all, there is a very important picture we have to set immediately. Here we're not talking specifically, not even in the case of the Italian city-states, of real, statal realities, right? There is not a uniformity, an homogeneity, a full centralization of modern type. We're talking essentially a cluster of neighborhoods, of intern guilds slash corporations, clans. This is the mob. Right, always remember this, that before the modern state, right, and before properly the nation state, who rules the world is the mob, because in a way or another, whichever of these communities was just a private entity that managed things in their own way, that had certain rights that were constantly negotiated with authorities, and that basically took matters in their own hands. So it was a very privatized reality, right? In the case of this big important cities and feudal kingdoms, we realize the monarchy is the guy, the big mobster that arrives over them and starts saying, start controlling them, drawing resources, making favors, exchange all this stuff. In more centralized reality like the Italian city-states, there is still the definition of a ever more centralized picture that, however, is still managed by the oligarchs, right? And there is definitely the process of state building in all this, right? It's obvious, from Italian urbanism, we have the Renaissance, modern Europe, the era of modern state, even political theory, right? That there is an important republican ideal emerging. Certain communities definitely had this stuff since a much longer time. We often, when we talk about cities, we often draw the distinction between those realities in Europe that could date back their municipal identity back to Roman times, literally, continuously since the ancient world into the Middle Ages, and others that were built from scratch or just emerged in later times, and from very different dynamics, like villages getting together, right, and And this is also a moment in which certain centers really boom, right? So that even what is built objectively, maybe around a pre-existing reality, is changing dramatically. And this is pretty evident in the 13th century from a demographic point of view, right? The expansion of cities is, macroscopically, from a urbanistic point of view. Look at the city walls, look at the archaeology, etc. There are, I don't know, there was maybe the original Roman ring, then there was built another one, and then another one. And the reason being that all around the city, behind the pre-existing city walls, were new suburbs of people that were coming from the countryside, working to mostly refining this tertiary industrial activities. Think about mostly textile work, industry and so on, that we'll talk about today, especially in terms of labor force. It was dramatically cheaper over this time. The big crack of the end of this period would actually leading to pretty serious problems that we'll not talk about now. But there is really, you have to think that before these times, nothing like this properly had ever existed, right? The cities themselves, if you look even at ancient Europe, you don't find, Roman cities were not, for example, so populated, so overcrowded like medieval ones, right? The reason we often trace comparisons by saying, oh, look, the Romans had that, the Middle Ages, they didn't even have aqueducts. They're two difficultly comparable realities, right? But the medieval city had a huge potential that the ancient world centers didn't quite have per se, right? Also, yes, we can look at a huge city like Rome as the capital of the empire, but that was essentially a center that survived largely also from the resources that were drawn from the outside, right? And it was almost parasitic to just have a few glass making, but it was just lots of people just managing that specific center because it was important in itself, but also being fueled from the external. In the Middle Ages, you have this dramatic fragmentation that brings every city to be essentially out there on its own. So to make it alone, and this is a dramatic, this makes a dramatic difference because there is no base, but essentially the city and the surrounding countryside. I always remember that if there is a city, it's not because it magically popped out, some merchant decided to build a place to stay and people flocked in there. No, it's a product of the countryside. So that speaks also for the economical, agricultural developments of the Middle Ages that were definitely greater than the ancient times, right? The ones of ancient times. And we could make loads of examples. The 80 cathedrals were built in Europe in a few, like in a century and a half. Out of the blue, nobody had ever seen that, right? In the history of civilization, but not even in other continents, fundamentally. At least, there are comparable pictures you can draw, especially in relative terms. But at that specific moment in history, there is the growth of Europe, especially the rates. If you look at the rates, it's something incredible. That I repeat, I'm not aware of any other reality that grew in pre-industrial times. Those rates, given that amount of resources available, also the technological potential was pretty low. So that's really another topic, on the causes that we will analyze on another occasion. But this speed, what I would like to stress, is what makes something completely new coming to happen, and that somebody had to regulate, right? I think probably the most important topic in any historical period is how politics and society adapted to new realities by actual, activation for it, right? The socio-economical, structuralist, ideas of, almost a mechanicistic reason for which things come to happen do not take into consideration the enormous political, juridical, cultural, artistical, urbanistic, architectural effort that came all together with lots of other things in here. The same this can be said for armies as far as our military history, historical interests are concerned. But it's all one, right? And therefore it's important to to talk, especially about this specific century, because the sheer magnitude of improvement had never been seen before, and very important things start happening, right? So these neighborhoods we were talking about before, these quarters, wherever the city was segmented, like, were normally, organized along craft or professional lines. They had usually common rural origins or membership in some sort of urban group or religious minority. They controlled usually the portion of countryside that was outside their side of the city, for their gate. Another way to count the city, to see how these cities were composed is considering the gate. Every of these neighborhoods had their own gate, and outside of it there was the land from which they took the stuff in. Naturally, everything gets complicated. I mean, just even historical geography tells you that it's never so simple that there is a geometrical pattern in this. And definitely 13th century complexity contributes to the articulation, the specialization of activities, so that every quarter usually was composed also by usually certain professions. Even though they were fundamentally autonomous realities, these things existed everywhere. I mean, think about the Achaia and Constantinople. I mean, quarters were literally like fortresses, as we'll see, well, especially in certain contexts, and where the clan ruled, right? It's our thing that we were talking about the mob specifically, because once you enter there, it's not that there is an authority out there that can say, look, now we police here, we do. Not even kings sometimes can do that. And they do not even have the interest. This is about keeping these guys happy, and you fundamentally do not have, not by the slightest, the force to make them change the way they live and so on. Usually, of course, they battle against each other, ferocious street battles, they destroy each other's buildings and so on. Fires were also, as you can imagine, pretty frequent. So yes, there were evidences of that. Naturally, the city worked as an organism together. The trace of such crafts that dominated particular neighborhoods is to be found in certain cities. For example, we know that in 1285 the prostitutes of Montpellier were directed to live on what earned the name of the Hot Street, right? It's a red light quarter essentially. And we know that the gold trade in Florence, the main bank in Central, we'll see later better, was historically on the Ponte Vecchio for more than 7 centuries, also during the modern age, right? So certain places naturally maintained for many reasons: patrimonial, political, logistic, whatever. Even military, naturally, the specific locations. So consider also that as pre-industrial societies, these things changed a lot for those time standards, of course, and that's why we studied them. But it was something still slow for our modern rhythms, right? So the permanence also in certain areas of certain activities was kind of normal. The interesting aspect is that at least for the majority of European cities, the urban development was unplanned, right? Things came to happen, people came to settle. There was no clear organization. This is not always true, of course, because there were cities that had, the city always had an administration on its own, so it was never completely avoided. But there was a lot of autonomy, as we've seen in these forms of organization. There were some tendencies that just for hygienic or mechanical reasons were, confined in certain areas. For example, the dirty trades like slaughtering, tanning, and fulling that have had all biological material and so on, tended to be located at the outskirts of the town, right? Or at least downstream from sources of drinking water, not to pollute it. And of course, they cared about their hygiene also at the time, because certain things were empirically known, pretty evident. There's an example, James I of Aragon obliged the Jewish dyers to move their workshop to the edges of Barcelona. But this is pretty normal. I mean, usually the residential quarters are the ones, that are in the inner city, right? Just even for sake of defense, of protection. Then like today in the periphery, there are more the industry, also properly the traffics, and the countryside was closer there. So even just for reasons of transport, it was easier to work certain goods in external side. Was the of the city was also usually where the market was held. Usually cities within the rings had a certain point a great space that was used for such conveniences, where market could be everything, also of cattle that required important space, but also for military reasons. That's usually the side from which the city was besieged, and therefore troops had to be encamped, needed had to space there. So these kind of measures. Certain cities were growing at this point also. I mean, the city was articulating itself, but Europe also was articulating itself in terms of specialization, production, right? Cities with extensive metalworking, right? Such as, for example, the ones of Lombardy, had real industries, were big things. Milan, Bergamo, Brescia endured the sound of hammering, the forge during daylight hours. That was a problem in acoustic pollution. Also, sound then continued to work during the night. The problem of noises, unfortunately, is something we all know something about, I believe, and was quite present at the time, right? Even pollution, think about even the smokes, right? We often say, well, what a beautiful air that was out there in the Middle Ages, right? Yeah, I mean, compared to our time standards, yes, but in certain areas, like you would have not liked really to leave, and for not talking about the strictly hygienic problems that you can imagine here. There weren't even proper sewers. People threw all their organic stuff in the streets, right? So that gives you a picture of how this goes. But if you had walked into a medieval city, I don't know, you would have found even corpses, but regularly. I mean, someone died, they put it a moment out of the city. The animals, they left dead animals sometimes in the street. Naturally, authorities tended to discipline but sometimes the people themselves lived together with their animals, also just for reasons of heating. Yes, they slept with the animals because they emanated heat. So, and this goes like it's how most of that world actually was. We're not speaking of the countryside, right? We know that pre-industrial societies were nightmarish. They were full of violence, of abuse, of poor misery, of any kind, moral, material. They were, not definitely beautiful communities, as even the romantic idea of the Middle Ages sometimes wants to be propagandated. But surely they all knew their deal. I mean, this happened because there was a specific function that these activities, brought the people to live like. And the location of various trades in particular parts of the cities meant that naturally there were a high proportion of people in the same craft of business in the local quarter, right? Local quarter also was usually identified through the urban parishes that strengthened at that point. The city was the center of the diocese and mostly was dominated by bishops. This is pretty well known. Look at the Holy Roman Empire, especially the importance of the German and the Italian bishops in the actual rule of the city as princes, as counts, right, as people that were really in charge. And naturally, there were practical, economical questions involved not only, but the parish naturally strengthened the sense of unity. These churches were sometimes built with the approval of the bishop, but by, as we'll see now with some example, by the local communities, and were naturally more rising, and especially during the 13th century, where also there is a great contrast, we'll talk about it another time, between the bishop and the mendicant orders, where very often took a political meaning because of, the first one being backed by the church, the other by the state, and, or it depends, actually, it's not that simple, but still, it's a matter of, think about testaments, of donations, and so on. It's money, right? It's something that but that also gives people a true spiritual focus, a sense of a community, of identity. The church here took care of all the charity of the poor. You will see it better in a while, and that's also the thing. But people, I don't know. Let's be honest. There is a whole side of the Western world that is anti-clerical by default, either because of anti-Catholic, or anti-clerical, but sometimes by communist background, because it's the idea that the church was bad, right? This is bullshit. Like, let me tell you, at this point of my, there is no. I mean, historiographically speaking, nobody ever terms anything like this anymore, right? And unless you're a Marxist, or nobody considers you a historically literate person, academically speaking, if you think that the church was bad and and that was worse or better than other realities at the time, it's a whole load of garbage, right? And it doesn't find any historical foundation of any kind. So the sooner we get rid of this, I always say these things quite open and loudly, because I don't care to have subscribers that actually believe in this, or at least if they do, they have to make up their minds, because the Middle Ages wasn't that, right? Not remotely close. These are things that we invented in later centuries because of political, historiographical, national, in fact, religious reasons that have nothing to do with the historical reality that we study every day from the sources. So nobody cares about it in where people really make the job done. At an academic level, nobody cares about whether people like the church or not. It's just stupid as a problem, and we study, and we must study that, because if you think you can't study not just medieval history, but history in the first place, without knowing ecclesiastical history, you don't know history. It doesn't matter where you come from. You can't understand it, because that was so rooted and part of every person's life at so many levels. Not just from a spiritual point of view, but properly a material, concrete point of view. If you don't understand how the church worked and why it existed, and the functionality and the obvious reasons for which it was needed at so many levels of education, of charity, of administration, of politics, even of military, you don't understand the Middle Ages. You don't understand history. You don't understand why this thing ever existed in the first place. Study history of religion. Study history of Christianity, because you can't go out there in this world if you don't know these things. Seriously, right? As many as others, right? It's not that this has a primacy or not. It's definitely one of the first things you want to start from. And speaking of parishes, of course, there was a great sense of representation within the same. Even at a political level, these centers played a huge importance. The idea of unity, that idea of that kind of mob-like identity of saying we were, baptized in the same church, we all share the same, the same porch, the same neighbor. We're all part of that community, right? It was a way to strengthen bonds, even just, when you had to go out there fighting in the streets and crushing each other's skulls, right? It was dramatically important in terms of the history of ideas is necessary, because even in here, if you don't get the moral forces involved, what's the point of studying anything about politics or warfare? It doesn't make any sense by the slightest, because that's the single most important thing. Also, as we were saying before, there was no strict divide between, classist interpretations of history do not hold at any level, especially within the old cities. The urban neighborhoods tended to include a mix of people from all social levels. These were horizontally and vertically divided societies at the same time. They were essentially big clienteles. Once again, the mob, and you have the powerful guys at the top, and that give job to all the others, right? And that protect them, and the others work for them. And it's the same idea of feudalism. It's the same exact thing. Those people are within the clientele for personal interests, or because they are obliged, because they're simply even part of the same elite, and they have a reason for staying there. It stays fluid, right? They're not rigid divisions. Definitely by the 13th century, this thing is growing. It is still very fluid and flexible. By the 14th, these clienteles will become to sclerotized. The guys at the top will gain way more power, and the others will be also blocked. There are surely class struggles at some point, especially with the textile workers that, as we're saying, we lived in appalling conditions, and at a certain point they revolt. But at the same time, there was a reason for that class to have originated in the first place, and there were basically all peasants that had fled the countryside to go live in the city. And there was all an administration, of course, in the hands of these neighborhoods. We know from Bergamo in 1292 that people cared about, how to make their fountain function. Naturally, it was all a matter of money. right? People, all the income of of the activities in the shop was put in at some level in social use, and they would organize themselves accordingly. The guilds, the corporations here, it's all one thing, right? It all began in the same way. So it was a capitalistic dynamic, right? As it's the natural one of within human beings. You have people who invest in their income into more lucrative activities. This thing, passing the hands of various people. At some point, they can channel into the hands of some. Others may gain more power, more wealth. But essentially, the great families, even if we see come to rule in the cities, and that very often were feudal in nature, right? Feudalism, the 13th century is the peak of feudalism. Even in the least feudalized areas of Europe, in terms of, but also the most urbanized. So we're talking where city-states emerge. It's not that if there is no king or prince, there is no cavalry. The elite were knights, and they lived as knights, and then sometimes creating, as a mob, really serious problems. So that the process of state building also passes through the disciplining of these people, as the modern state begins as the disciplining of the privates, fundamentally from preventing them from doing whatever the heck they like, because it turns out that whatever the heck people like to do is, oppressing one another, and at a certain point there is it's realized by more and more people that there can't be a dialogue and negotiation with this thing, and it passes through violence, right? And there is a good example of how, but what we're saying is that in the same neighborhood, live people of very different social conditions. There's an example from the neighborhood around the Church of San Matteo in Genoa. There's a very good example of this social stratification. The Church of San Matteo was a parish church within a cluster of 45 towers. Right? You know that medieval Italy is mostly famous for these house castles, house towers more specifically. Really were a very highly militarized urban society that spent basically all the time, battling against each other. Whoever had the tallest tower could shoot the most crossbows, bolts, and throw stones instead of on the others. It was a great competition. Naturally, it was also a matter of literally of space, like in other times historically. Think about Amsterdam, where you see all those tall houses that are very thin, narrow, but that because they had to pay a tax for the surface they occupy. So the taller the house was, they would have paid the same. They would have had the more space they would have had, but the price would have stayed theoretically the same. Here there were more specifically military reasons. Fortified house towers are most famous from still standing in cities like Bologna or San Gimignano, extremely famous touristic locations. Exactly, also because of this specific skyline. That you imagine that these cities at the time, like near him in Bologna, there are just like two, in San Gimignano a bit more. But you have to think of a standard medieval city in that kind of hundreds of towers of several tens of meters tall, right? Like skyscrapers, all thick, and they could we know they used trebuchet throwing at each other's towers. This the mess you can imagine. As we were saying before, the wall space was militarized. In Genoa is actually a very good example of this in terms of civic strifes and this kind of urban look, because Genoa perhaps was one of the most privatistic city-states in the peninsula, right? Differently from Venice, that centralized quite soon in the hands of few. Basically, Genoa would remain even during Renaissance as, all these clans that controlled part of the city, and that was properly the state. It was not strong over rule. And in fact, the true state emerged as a private bank, the Bank of St. George. That was the one that founded Spain after the failure of the Fugger. And it was all in the hands of these very powerful families. Well, in the San Matteo neighborhood lived the Doria Clan, or Doria Clan, that was, even in here, a powerful noble lineage, right? Which had in this neighborhood allies, independents. When you think it's in earlier time, here in the 13th century, maybe not so much. I mean, in earlier times, these clans were very extended, right? We were talking about a family. We're talking about hundreds of people. So it's a different actual picture from it. We'll make a video about that at some point. But they're all, I mean, some are knights, some are notaries, some are merchants, right? There is that kind of differentiation. Families were very different from today. And in the Middle Ages, it's just from these, and exactly from these societies here that were more complex and needed a better juridical definition of who the people were, etc., that the concept of modern family, as far as the legal questions are concerned, emerges, because it has to define strictly now this huge amount of wealth that pours into the hands of these merchants of transcontinental trade, especially in the 13th century. Otherwise, people didn't even have a surname, right, on a regular basis. Not even by the 13th. Even in these specific realities, there was all that differentiation. But actually, all the dependents lived in the neighborhood as well, the workers. The Doria, as we were saying before, had, as a noble clan, also possessions outside. Actually, all these had possessions outside the city. But even outside, far outside, most of their properties were concentrated in the Scrivia Valley north of Genoa, and also in the area of the Riviera of the east of the city, near the Abbey of San Frutuoso. That is beautiful location. I don't know if you've ever visited those areas. It's a monastery in the sea with all the Doria tombs, and which was an asset. Right, remember that even previous to these times, aside from the development of the city, some of the most advantageous investments for a noble family in medieval Europe was found in monastery, right? Because it had specific exemptions and rights, and it was a more sound investment than other activities, and it surely gave also in terms of prestige and status and so on. Connections with the church and so on. But what it means is that under the Doria, a lot of migrants from the aforementioned areas outside Genoa tended to settle within the city in the area of San Matteo. So when you look at these buildings where they lived, you have 3 or 4 stories tall structures, right, that reflected very much, literally, the vertical social organization of the quarter, because the poorer people lived in the noisy, gloomy bottom floors and alleyways, where also the shops, the more, the animals, as you understand, also stayed. And while the upper stories were more expensive, right? They paid higher rents. They were also the ones that usually were also better protected by fires. Didn't really save anyone, but these were all at least just think about the hygienic conditions we were saying before. I mean, living close to the street wasn't such a great deal. Even today, there's less, more confusion, more smoke or noise. The higher you were, the better the air was in general. And this makes you realize that these social classes live together, right? The Doria controlled paternalistically these people, looked for their interests to be guarded and defend the quarter, the neighborhood. In the process, we were saying lots of people were coming to live within the city, and most of them in search of wage labor, right? There were people that knew that in the city there were new activities that compared to the rhythms of the country work were naturally appeared to be more remunerative. Naturally, it was more of a gamble, right? Also because by the way, the political stability of these realities was horrifying, right? There were upheavals, coups, sieges, wars, so changes in international. It could, it wasn't easy to live out there. So, but in the countryside, definitely, there was a similar process also of stratification. So many communities started to feel or oppressed also by the big landlords, by the same city sometimes. So they said, you know what, instead of living here, having to pay the rent, having to break my back, I'll try fortune in the city, right? And most of these people, just like they ended up to just to work for as very cheap labor force. We're talking about casual laborers, sometimes journeymen, women too. Women were exploited in a way that sometimes they participated in the heaviest works and were paid less than men at the time. Naturally, there were also better integrated workers of, also the families of those who owned some business, the apprentices that worked in small shops, and also some large enterprises like shipyards. For masters who were the guys with power, with money, with the property, who had frequently organized themselves into guilds, and were the guys who would, expand and rocket to the top at some point, right? They had begun maybe themselves as peasants at the time. Then it would become merchants, and then from there bankers, and then from there entering in the major oligarchy of the city, then maybe becoming lords, and then maybe marrying into the regional and sometimes in the international nobility. So these are important. The cities are important places for promotion. Naturally, just a few would manage that. So we're talking about guilds. Look at the vernacular terms. Also, in different areas of Europe have all different names. The métier, the guild, the Arte, the Zunft, that more or less is like the same thing, right? It's a corporate organization, characteristic of medieval society, very often involved into a kind of mercantilistic business at the end of the day, because whatever they produced was now in these cities as hubs of international trade, sold on also more profitably often on a large scale. The other people, men and women, instead supported themselves just with daily wage, right? They were paid normally on the payday of a 6-day week. So sometimes also naturally very short term, on Saturday usually, and these people literally survived, right? Most of the world at the time lived in survival rates economy. The same was in the cities, right? Yeah, it was slightly better than living in the countryside from some point onwards, but at the same time, which depends on, this is just on average, but still it sucked. Like there was no activity in here where people, if not a very few, right, especially those who emerged through banking, that came to be, as we were saying before, just a few families, but the majority of the people everywhere, even just in normal politics or the military, etc., in the countryside, wouldn't become dramatically richer, right, just by working. That's also why war was a big deal at the time, because there were violent struggles. It was a great level of risk, a great level of competition, and everything was dramatically ferocious. Also, the complexity of the cities, the coinage, the rise of markets, increasingly specialized economy, which it's not something that happens, quickly, normally, on a regular basis. It's really because of the demand. A very big city like Paris had at least 100 different guilds, and ones were had very specific trades. For example, book clasps making could be as a craft could be found just in a university city like Paris, like for the center of European theology could be. As we saw in also in those videos about medieval urbanism, it's not that there were so many cities that reached that level of development. I mean, most what we would call cities, it's actually towns. To have a civitas, you need very specific requirements. It's very different to talk about, a city-state or a town, right? There's a bit of confusion on this because very often it's the sheer difference in scale in terms of urbanization levels and economic development are a bit overlooked in our popular view of the Middle Ages. But anyhow, guilds rocket in this period all across Europe. Then you know how apprenticeship worked. Young boys and girls acquired some vocational education. They went working in these shops for free, right? Because their parents wouldn't pay for their education, but they would get experience and would work for free in the meanwhile for their masters. And they would acquire naturally this knowledge they could sell at some point. And so once the apprentice was completed, they would find a job wherever, maybe in the same place where they started. And this meant, as today actually, that most people would have spent a lifetime working for others, right? And there was a great variety, naturally, in the possibility, careers, and so on, right? And by the 13th century, there are lots of capitals going around. They're starting being managed even more at the top, of the hierarchy with the masters, that were those who formally also belonged to this, to the that made up these guilds, participated to the councils, the assemblies. These people paid for lots of stuff, right? Because these corporations, as we've seen, were the ones that effectively ruled the city. So if the city was at war, I don't know, for the king or whatever, among others, these guys would have to supply all the food. Think about logistics. If you're feeding an army, feeding a city, because at the end of the day, these were high dynamic concentration points that had to be maintained in that sense. There are beautiful examples. Think about Ottokar's and the seconds of Bohemia campaigns against Hungary in Austria. Vienna's largely provided for the, as a major city in the area, the supplies, the thing. That's also what the cities were what monarchs were mostly interested in, exactly because of these resources that they could find just all concentrated in one place, that could also be, they were more anxious to be spared from the aims of the higher nobility, and that the king as an overruler could find points in common with the city for this reason. That's why capitals start fixing here. We're talking about Paris, London, that is a true capital even before Paris, historically and in the function proper, because they're centers of administration. They provide clerk, they provide skilled laborers, they provide technology, right? Even for war, these are the places where you can find the best stuff, just in terms of material culture. And in the best quality, because that's where at least the market was. So whatever worked, coming from wherever, you could find it there. And naturally giving rights, extending the capabilities of these centers, their freedoms, at least in the face of the interference of other noblemen from the outside, was a way to expand this harbor, say, of possibilities of supplies, of availability. There was, in this regard, exactly a great connection between the masters and the kings, international trades, the church. Many city-states were born, as I was saying before, in episcopal, cities where the bishop made the comital, performed the comital functions, that properly ruled the city there. So even in here, the risk was quite high. There was no proper security, and assurances actually start being created this time, especially for maritime trade. The Italian city-states make this dramatic advancement in accounting, mathematics, business, practice, and they invent money. They invent properly paper money, right? That's something that delivers from it is one of the greatest inventions in history of mankind. as far as you don't have to shift the precious metal, just pay with this paper. That eventually, at the end of the day, wherever all these branches scattered all over Europe will, develop. Will make the calculation of the expenses and the gains, and the result would be eventually, asked in sometimes not just in money, but also in money, because money is born even just as the coins proper for that reason, but been paying with other goods and so on. With the crack of the 14th century, naturally, and also because of other accidents, maybe a ship sunk, or there was an illness of some decline of some trade. I mean, individuals, but also entire groups could simply go bankrupt, lose employment, become poor, and together with them, lots of other people, right? Lots of, sometimes entire countries, because you go bankrupt. Mostly, all these financial resources are mostly spent for war, by at least the political, as far as big loans were concerned. It was about trade, but I mean, some of the higher risks naturally were also profits were associated to this more like violent intrusion in someone else's markets, and it's no surprise that wars were funded by these people. However, this was not just financial. The overwhelming economy was agriculture, as we know. However, properly, city economy and society is defined by the guild system in Western Europe, and guilds existed pretty much in every center, like in port towns as well. Naturally, the fierce competition between them would bring to some to be swallowed, and by others would become bigger fish, and strengthen, consolidate, and invade other markets, and so on. And together with it, the same authorities that naturally control this trade, that were, as we've seen at the same time, those people who in the councils decided, whether to send armies somewhere or not. I mean, so it was a deep political involvement. It was all intertwined. Most of medieval work depended on daylight, right? Life began at daybreak. Together with the other activities, people went to bed with darkness. It was a wholly different world, and naturally, the invention of clocks, and especially the fact that these started to appear also in the cities, in more busy places where people needed to calculate more time. You're a peasant, you could work with light daytime, and there were certain things that really took that time. It wasn't much more complex than that. It was extremely exhausting. Cities need to calculate more, to refine more, that because they're more articulated, more specialized, right? And the church bells also, that also in the countryside helped to define the working day. Some work naturally was seasonal. In the city, in the port cities, the sailing season also dominated an important part of work, especially in the north, where the traffics were less discontinuous because of the weather, like in the Baltic and the North Sea, but also in parts of the Mediterranean. There was a good season, bad season, but it was more, let's say, lasted longer. Consider that merchants traveled sometimes for years, right? Not just even for months. So also that is a time length was in consideration in this regards. The problem here, as we were saying before, was also feeding all this mass of people. There were great ovens for mass production of bread scattered across the city, right? This included naturally the necessity of firewood, also water, actually, to clean. There were, hygienic problems at that point. Had to be, needed to all this washing away. In Paris and in other cities in Northern Europe, there were town criers that shouted out the price of wine in taverns every day, except on Good Friday, for when the monarch or a member of his family happened to die, right? But this was pretty much universal, I presume. Some neighborhoods naturally were less hospital in a sense. Think about the clattering of the loom, or the newly prominent cotton and silk industries. The smells in the streets during the tanning. Think about the trades of the animals that passed there. Most people were fed with, so there weren't healthy places to live in the first place, especially as far as the residences of the skilled laborers, of the wage laborers were. These people were fed basically just through wine and ale. So it's essentially readily expandable energies. Food in this sense could be produced with enormous quantities without much problem. The wine helped also to endure the hardships of the works, the physical strains, but these people were chronically deprived of proteins and fats, and that's why also their immunity defenses were lower. They would die much more in proportion than the richer people during plagues, as it would be even especially in the mid 14th century. But the important thing is that this system, however, worked. I mean, here it's the moral forces of the need of earning, the vision that drove this society, that made all this thing go on and well, right? And we reach here some of the greatest concentrations of wealth in the history of the Middle Ages. Like a city like Florence was literally the richest city in the world at a time, which meant that in terms of per capita wealth, this is here where the living conditions of Antony in Rome were met, right after more than 1 millennium, and this would spread. Like, it was much more, in terms of average living conditions in the cities, at least. This thing was spreading in all these various centers in Europe. Merchant activity naturally meant the accumulation at some point of enough wealth, and the development of this managing banking systems, fundamentally, that would emerge, in fact, in these richer centers, where we find these new institutions first appearing in the Italian cities like Florence, Lucca, Piacenza, Siena, so all in the central north part of the peninsula. For different reasons, these were also different cities altogether, but they are in common with they have this sector, credit sector in common. There is also the need. There are different spiritual needs derived from this. People, first of all, become more literate, right? The same city work requires for people to get skilled in letters and numbers, and also there is a greater availability of resources, right? It's paradoxical that society gets ever more regulated, and I don't know, women, for example, that up to this point enjoying a fairly good autonomy in legal matters, in patrimonial owning, at this point are, by the same corporations, are gradually put aside, especially in the richer center, the greatest center, because this was a way of reducing the possibilities of it was a way to centralize it, in a way to make ever less people in control of the power, and this would naturally were men, for those mind standards, but of course women didn't have the same legal they have the same rights of men since the beginning, but now things went even worse. But at the same time, we're talking about a more prosperous society altogether. Like, women also had a higher education than before as men. And many of these people naturally had ambitions, had intellectual interests. They wanted to know the world. They wanted to have even to study the scriptures more closely. They wanted to dispose of even of their the afterlife, predispose for their afterlife, in a way that could fulfill their needs. So this is the moment of the spread of the distinctively urban Franciscan and Dominican convents that grow in number in the cities, that I was saying before, also create a competition with the local bishop because they depended on different authorities. This was a way for the cities for the papacy to intervene more directly in the affairs of the local, the higher clergy at the local level, and these people would assist the. This is important because Franciscans and Dominicans, as you know, as Mennonites, were more humble, generally speaking, less powerful, especially at the beginning. They were essentially the copy of those evangelic, pauperistic movements, orders that had emerged, often also from an heretical background. I mean, the Franciscans were borderline Orthodox, technically. The Dominicans had been born to fight the Cathars. And there was a broader contestation, protest against the higher clergy. So the Pope, at a local level, so we're talking about bishops, archbishops, that were often also, they were within the church, but politically speaking, they were pretty autonomous. They did whatever the heck they liked, sometimes even against papal policy. So actually presenting these new poors that would handle ecclesiastical matters and found new houses in the cities, right? That had been the hubs, actually did the cradles of the same heresies, right? Heresies didn't spread among the peasants that they didn't even know about, they didn't even care probably about these things, if not for revolting, trying to overthrow the system at some point. But also the problem of orthodoxy had to be, the problem of heterodoxy had to be checked by these people. So, as we know, we made videos about this. The Franciscans and Dominican orders were an astonishing success, and they would get ever more donations from the side of the people. There were also these formulas. Think about the Beguines, the Bigots, these people that fundamentally lived a bit in between the monastic life and the urban one, right? So there is a bit of also a secularizing idea of what you can live like. These orders offered a way to, work a bit for them, and then so earning their due also for afterlife, and then being part of a community, right? Think about, there were lots of widows at the time. Women married very early. I said they also died, unfortunately, very early because child birth was one of the most dangerous things and mortal things at the time together because of infections. And however, they married very early, so they usually remained widows, and sometimes it wasn't that easy to remarry. So these orders presented certain, like the possibility of living in another world wasn't just purely the secular one, and that could give them something to do, like a purpose, a focus, an activity, right? And even actually earning something, because they naturally made charity, but also they produced on their own. I don't know. When night fell, some works continued. Also, crime increased. Like going to medieval and ancient times by night was saying, there were people who made testament when this happened. Considered that illumination was just candle light, and candles were expensive actually, so the whole situation was pretty dark altogether. There were watchmen, there were guards, sentinels, but that was especially for avoiding coups from city walls. Certain neighbors you would have not liked to pass there. Sundays and church feasts by the 13th century were pretty happened pretty often. We're talking about 70 to 80 days a year, and which is a lot. This is typical also of the ancient world. They provided this rest and enjoyment for those at least who could afford it, right? But for the majority of people, of laborers, that was just unpaid holidays. And actually, here we could digress and see how even these holidays were part of the economy at the end of the day. But still, it had a logic. Maybe it's not just so purely an imposition or something bad, or an idea of laziness. No, it didn't work like that. There was a lot of space for earning, for working, generally speaking. There were nobles that invested. If you think about tournaments, there were religious innovators, events that happened every once in a while, runaway serfs and poors. Um, um, Even every chance, the passage, for example, of an important person, right? It passed normally through the cities were major communication, so it was a great event, right? These people paid, slept, ate. We've seen university centers how lucrative they were. As we were saying already before, one of the major problems the city governments faced was to keep the mob happy, right? To keep the population healthy, content, right? Because as we were saying before, the volatility of political stability here was pretty high, right? These people could make a freaking mess. They could revolt. They could be coups, takeovers, invasions, this major distractions, right? Battles, violences of all kinds, and especially that's where the regulating, the statal, the state building began, because people said, what do we have to do this? We're looking at a freaking amount of money just because there are a bunch of idiots that want to kill each other because they're just living like a thug's lifestyle. And this happened all the time. In the 13th century, the cities were dominated still, as we've seen, by the knights that made these huge banquets in the streets that were, even good activities from an economical point of view. That a band of thugs arrived from the rival clan, and they started making a freaking mess. They destroyed all the shops. They started fires, crossbow bolts, catapults. Yeah, that's how in a nutshell reality was, right? It's pretty well documented as well. It's almost funny, what do you think the bishop does in all this? I remember once in Pisa, the bishop brings a catapult into a private backyard to bombard one of the, of the factions who were fighting. It's that bad, right? And it happens all the time. This is the funny thing of it. And naturally, there are various shades, but the city, what is fascinating here, we don't even talk today about the symbolism of the city, but the city is like a universe on its own, right? The city walls defined literally an inside and an outside that do matter a lot. And the city is mainly a political center, so that all these agitations and tensions are obvious to take place there, because the city is the center of that world and of the surrounding one, of the countryside, right? So it's really a big deal. So you can imagine illness, poverty, crime, sanitation, fraud, ignorance, all questions that create losses, right? If you don't cure this stuff, you will gain less. So that's where the councils start doing something about this, and the solutions are not easy, right? But the masters, the guildsmen, know how to solve them, because they're the same people who make that the system work. So they know how to oil it. They know how at least to facilitate certain processes and to make it better in a way. So it's impossible to make a synthesis of all the various solutions. Maybe we'll talk about it individually in other videos. But there were different players in here. First of all, we were saying before about the church, right? The idea is that the ecclesiastical structures remained, entities remained responsible for dispensing much urban charity, right? And this was definitely also a model for the rest of for secular authorities. The poor, the sick, abandoned people, orphans, widows, as I was saying before, there were a lot, right? In medieval times, it was normal to watch crawling the streets all these vagabonds. It was normal. It was also in the Christian mindset at the time. Like, yeah, it was fine. Christ was after all, could be behind each of these figures. there was an important. It was like the whole world was like that, so nobody was more or less shocked. It's just from the modern age where there is a ever more, increased social control, where you could get rid of these people. Sometimes we're also violent, create the problems we were saying before, violence, and nobody actually cared because these were worlds also where even low function if you had the money to make it function, right? It's not that everywhere, just major issues of social security were taken seriously by the collectivity. For the rest, it was a pretty bad times and places to live in. So as we were saying before, parishes and monasteries within the city gates of Franciscans and Dominicans, but also sometimes orders like the one of the Hospitaliers, or the leper houses established by the new order St. Lazarus, took care of these problems. Abandonment of children was a big deal in the 13th century because not much differently from today, all this economical pressure brought mothers to simply get rid of their children. There were specific, even here, charity institutions established to safeguard these children and their mothers, right? The church would take care, and this gives you also an idea of how tough, more diseased and problematic society was becoming. There is evidence, information of an hospital in Troyes decreeing in 1263 that they couldn't accept any more abandoned children because they feared to be overwhelmed by them. That gives you the numbers. And most guilds, as we were saying before, as the mob, took care of their own distressed members for free, let's say, or at least, for internal connections we don't even know precisely. Naturally, there were also more, open, under the sun activity, like donating goods, food, or money to the broader community of the city. That was an electoral, pretty clever electoral measure that had always existed. Christ's poor were the business of the church. It was the idea, but in general, the city governments were not providers of social services to the needy for this specific reason. Yet they were responsible in the measure to which, for example, allow certain institutions to be created, the spaces, the infrastructures. So that all fit at the same time in such problems. And charity was, as we've seen before, was done by people normally, right, and consistently, so that that money wasn't just like a gift, but even there was some practical, political, social consequence deriving from it that was pretty clear to those people at the end of the day. Much more than it is to us today, if you want, because societies were smaller and it was clear where such monies would impact. The church also was naturally benefiting from this in a way or another, because they received the legacies and charitable donations that the church itself had. The 13th centuries where the popes and the Angevins properly create what we can start talking about in terms of a bureaucracy, right? And a sustaining ideology behind it. So it was an extended network. It had important international connections. It worked on the base of some of the most important authorities at the time. This century, the papas in the Kingdom of France are indeed, and that were allies were not surprisingly disregarded. So actually, that's where the good we were talking about before, the assistance that saved people's lives. Not all, of course, from things like starvation, abandonment, or solitary death, but still doing an important job, and also partly contributing to education, saving children, and giving them a future, right? They gave them an education, sometimes in a career in the church, and so on. And that happened, as we've seen, at different levels of society. It was not a divide between the church and the rest of society. It was all one. So it was actually very important. The church was present physically, like with people that would interact. Would, life was also dramatically shorter, or much more troubled. So, psychologically speaking, there were different, a very different worldview, different approaches to reality. Right, just think about children mortality. Other important problems, concerns were public health and safety, as we were saying. We've seen night watches, town criers, naturally private people drafted into public responsibilities. That's how the communes, the city-states operated. They said, these were. That's the thing. It was not like a state that imposed it. It was the same communities that decided, in a way, to do it, and gradually, exercising power more intensely on, let's say, on themselves, or at least on those social divides also were creating. So, for example, the local town militias were normally organized on a rota system, right? Some only a part of them go out for military expeditions, for the town watch, this stuff. A certain amount of them had to keep their weapons, ready and in good state, and this naturally was everybody's interest at some point, but there were much deeper political implications in various clashes. In the bigger cities, like for example in London, we have the assizes of bread and ale that we're looking at the price and quality of these commodities, right? During the 13th century, Henry III and Edward I, right, they were also, as you know, great, very statally oriented in their policy, encouraged London's authorities to guarantee the hygiene of the markets, for example, and also to look into broader issues of urban sanitation that would therefore stabilize the city and also the monarchy as a consequence. Regulating the price of bread loaves, right, the quantity of them. It was perhaps the public business per excellence, right? The idea how much did grain cost, consequently the bread. That was crucial, because whoever controlled the city. That was always like that. It was like that in ancient times, was like medieval times. And you understand that in moments of like there were imagine famines that were pretty frequent. Like at some point, the city had to pay for import grain at some point, and that took a generalized decision. That wasn't decisional process you could postpone, because people were starving and they would assault. There would be a massive revolt. So that's where the state is born. That's where the realization that you have to have organisms, authorities, institutions that take care of this quickly, right? That also maintain an adequate amount of supplies or stocks readily available in case of emergency. This all passed initially through a private net, but it was regularized as naturally also power centralized. So this began sometimes in association with more or less powerful guilds, right? Which could be butchers or bakers, but also the fat merchants, as we're called in some place. The oligarchs, bankers, and there were sometimes they were the guys that actually maintained, that issued some men and women to actually control the standards of quality of the loaves and the relative prices, right? So, considering the European average, there were some approximate, some rudimentary ways of achieving this. But in the most advanced centers, this definitely took the shape of a very, important branch of the administration. Consider that also the tolls were all paid sometimes on the price of these goods, these main commodities. That's how you could actually control the international situation from an economical point of view. How much did grain or wine cost in some neighboring places? that was incredibly important, right? Or far away. They knew, because they knew that if there was a famine somewhere from the other side of Europe, that could be an opportunity or a danger, depending on situation, because that equated to the price would go would go up, and therefore someone could profit it, some would lose. Those were massive assets would shift on the market, and there were precious indicators of the economic, also of what politically would happen at some point, right? Much more of this to be said, actually, and then we'll leave it for other videos. So there were, in the state building, that this is something you don't have to give for granted. I mean, the idea of prisons, right? You have to know that up to this point, prisons didn't, as we know them, didn't actually exist, right? The idea that you would detain someone for a certain amount of time was not a real, like, for public issues. One thing was prisoners of war. It was normal. Think about the city versus city wars that continuously happened, but there would be major, even locals and infrastructure destined for this. But the idea was that those were normally people someone would pay for ransoming, and they would go away. But the idea of actually imposing, delivering justice by picking criminals and putting them in jail, well, that's something that didn't exist up to that point, because normally people were either killed or their goods confiscated, and that kept happening, actually. But there was more than that, and it began actually as a maneuver from public authorities to actually ransom people, like in normal cases, right? Even in there wasn't the idea was something different from the usual, but there was, from a juridical point of view, that the beginning of the idea that you could actually detain someone for something bad that had happened, right? And all this needed, in turn, lawyers, guards, executioners. I mean, this gave job as well. It required specifically a juridical theory that could back it, like saying, we're part of this community, so we have rights and duties, and we have to be very, serious about this if we want to be taken as an authority. This increases with the deterrence, right? You start finding pretty interesting stuff. Like I studied them in my research. For example, the disarming of the citizenry, right? It's not like today that you have guns, and at least the police is pretty capable of using it, or some paramilitary police, whatever, can deliver actually a hell of a shock force to disperse riots and so on. But which is difficult still today, telling the truth, right? And dangerous still today. At the time, even lots of people with stones, I mean literally, could overwhelm some of the best military professionals, and especially in cities. Why? Because the cities were not battlefields. There were just a very few open spaces where normally, in fact, battles would take place, and the spaces that were located mostly close to the public palace or the church. I mean, to the major buildings that also could work as fortresses, but also were, supplies, weapons, were stored, and that therefore worked a bit like important strongholds where you could control the city from at some point, unless the city besieged you in turn. So that it was important to control at least the populace, and starting saying, who do you actually, how much weapons can you actually keep? And for example, the artillery, we're talking here about catapults, ballistas, and stuff like that were present at the time in private arsenals within the cities. And we're saying about it before. Well, at this point, it started becoming a monopoly of the start, right? It's not it's by the 13th century. It's still rare to find an actual full control in these days, but it started to be a monopoly of the public authorities, which was quite interesting because think about the catapult bolt. in enfilade fire in a city street, can't, blow into pieces several people, and that's quite fascinating, right? So, and would you be? We were saying before, even we have massacres of knights at the hands of these people, simple people, the people that everybody considered cowardly and useless and inept in open field, but that in the cities, in those freaking narrow streets, could make a hell of a warfare, right? And also given that they were rich, because sometimes they all in all the stocks were of weapons and stuff were in the city, so even just an average no one could load himself with enough armor as much as even a knight had. It's very well documented, actually. And those were difficult to knock out. So that's interesting, because this, the possibility of such events to take place were much more frequent than it seems. And they would happen, and they would become ever more dangerous given the complexity of the society here. Right? Tendentially, yes, the oligarchs towards, especially the 14th century, will take over. But, there would be a lot of revolts before, because also all those salaried workers didn't like it very much. Right? So they fought their way, they revolted, even created their own government, eventually to be wiped out, yes. As it would happen in the countryside, think about the Jacquerie, but in the main textiles industries of Italy and Flanders, the 14th century of pretty hot, of revolts, and it was a big deal at the time, and it contributed in turn to define that statal control. We find even single individuals that remain famous, such as Etienne Boileau, the Prévôt of Paris for Louis IX, which is a big deal because that's one of the peaks of French power and control of, royal authority on the country. And being the Prévôt of the royal Prévôt of Paris meant this guy had to make work one of the largest cities in Europe, and managing an incredible amount of communities of resources. The same goes for the podestà of the Italian communes, the Italian city-states, that also demonstrate this increasing professionalization of the public service. The Italian city-states were pretty large as cities, demographically speaking, the richest per capita in the world at the time. So think about the interests, the pressures, the duty. In fact, these podestas at the end of the day turn out they're essentially called to be arbiters for between the factions that continues to fight against each other all the time, mostly to make justice work. So they had to be juridically skilled and so on. But more time passes, the more they have to become essentially military commanders, and not much because of the military, not because of the increasing clashes in the cities. Actually, those would decrease in a sense, but rather because in fact the commune proper, the communal government, right, had managed to freeze a bit the situation. And podestà would be delegated just to be a military commander during the campaigns outside the city, right? So and that's where the process of state building was going ahead from the center here. Right, not like a monarchy like in France, where you have a king that objectively owns a freaking lot of estates. There are probably large chunks of the country that are not ruled by cities; they are ruled by feudal lords. Right, in an Italian city-state that basically has a district of like a few tens of kilometers, and that's pretty much it. But it's still very rich, and the idea is that you're a monad into in the midst of other 30 of the same type of powers. They're constantly struggling against one another, and that's what brings this ferocious competition, most likely to make also, that republic and the process of state building emerge, because they literally had to do everything on their own, with the risk of annihilation, or at least it's not that the city was ever wiped out physically, but and they would continue, but to be governed by someone else, by a foreigner in the same, even if it was just a few tens of kilometers away, was what you didn't want, because also the city would be exploited dramatically from an economical point of view. But it's mostly for another chapter. So yeah, I mean, I wanted to pretty much talk about this, and there would be a lot more to say about medieval cities during the 13th century. So definitely, there are gonna be at least other 2 or 3 videos to come about this. Ideally, then of course it could never be over at a certain point, but this is to give you the properly the dimension uh, of the complexity of this reality as it was forming at this point, and how for many centuries would have not existed in the same, at least were in the same uh, degree of cinetic energy. No, I don't want to say of complexity necessarily, but possibly also complexity actually. But still, the the idea that something booms, something that is created all of a sudden, and you need to regulate it. And these are some of the most fascinating chapters in history. We actually live a bit like in them today, right? It doesn't. They usually do not end well. Because they open to like the reason this boom has stopped, like for our current times, is not good immediately. But still, society has to be regulated in a different pattern. That's usually where the oligarchy takes over, where there is a process of certification. Naturally, today it's a different time, but don't think it's so different at the end of the day. In broader dynamics. Anyhow, for now we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.